Welcome to the Top 10 Jewish Composers. Boston's Hebrew College presents a series of educational podcasts and a concert looking at the most prominent composers of music with Jewish content. In order to focus such a wide-ranging conversation, this year we will be concentrating on classically trained composers who wrote either liturgical music or secular music based on Jewish themes. There will be a series of 5 video podcasts. Each one will explore a compelling issue or theme related to the topic and will examine composers who might qualify for the final top 10 list. Today we tackle the most basic question: what do we mean when we say Jewish music? Let me introduce the members of today's panel. Rabbi Daniel Lehman is the 8th president of Hebrew College. He previously served as the founding headmaster of Gann Academy, the new Jewish high school of Greater Boston, and the founding director of BIMA, the Berkshire Institute for Music and Arts. Now I believe it's the Brandeis Institute for Music and Arts. A graduate of Yeshiva University and its rabbinical school, Rabbi Lehman has been acknowledged for his innovative leadership in Jewish education. And I might add, from personal experience, Rabbi Lehman is also a fine singer and a connoisseur of fine music. Judith Pinellas is the RIS Humanities Librarian at the Goldfarb Library at Brandeis University and adjunct instructor of Jewish music at Hebrew College. Judith has degrees in both music and library science and has written numerous articles on various aspects of Jewish music with a special emphasis on the role of women. She is also editor of the website, the Jewish Music Web Center. Cantor Dr. Brian Mayer is acting dean of the School of Jewish Music at Hebrew College and serves as cantor of Temple Emmanuel in Providence. Prior to his appointment at Hebrew College, he taught for 14 years at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York as assistant professor of Chazanut. He is a recognized scholar of cantorial music and has produced numerous highly successful concerts and recordings.
Our moderator is Joshua Jacobson, who is a professor of music and director of choral activities at Northeastern University and visiting professor and senior consultant in the School of Jewish Music here at Hebrew College. He is also the founder and director of the Zamir Chorale of Boston, a world-renowned ensemble specializing in Hebrew music. He is a frequent guest conductor and visiting lecturer and has authored several books, dozens of articles, and over 100 published compositions, arrangements, and editions.
Thank you, Danny. I'll start the ball rolling. What is Jewish music? Music can't be Jewish. Only people can be Jewish. I prefer the expression, the music of the Jewish people. But if we are to insist on this taxonomy to determine whether or not a musical artifact can be classified as Jewish, we would have to identify Jewish elements, markers, signifiers inherent in the artifact. What and how prevalent are the Jewish elements in this musical artifact? What about other elements? Are the Jewish signifiers more prevalent than the non-Jewish signifiers? For example, if we sing Adon Olam, a Jewish hymn, to the tune of Take Me Out to the Ball Game, and yes, I've heard it done that way, what are the Jewish parts of it? Well, the text, the context, and what are the non-Jewish parts of it? The tune. How do they balance? Do they create cognitive dissonance? But what are Jewish signifiers? What marks, first of all, a person as Jewish? This can be a very complex issue from a legal point of view, but I'm just dealing with perceptions for now. Maybe we can ask, where do you worship? In what language? With what liturgy? What style of worship? In a synagogue, or a church, or a mosque? That's a signifier. The observance of the calendar. Do you observe Hanukkah instead of Christmas, or Saturday instead of Sunday, or Friday? What about the physical traits? Oh my God, think about those Nazi propaganda posters. The big, crooked, bulbous nose, the thick lips. We won't deal with circumcision. But do these traits apply to all Jews? Or are there non-Jews who could be described in the same way? What about your mode of dress? Perhaps the most obvious thing is the person wearing a kippah, or Hasidic garb, your hairstyle, your beard, side locks, peyot, your preference for certain foods or avoidance of certain foods. I remember being surprised the first time I went to Eastern Europe and discovering that bagels and pastrami and borscht and kasha varnikas, blintzes, stuffed cabbage, those are not Jewish foods. They're Russian foods. They're Polish foods. What about your native language, your mother tongue? Is it Yiddish instead of English? What about your name, your first name, your last name? If you see somebody whose name is Abraham Cohen, you get one impression. If the person's name is Christopher O'Reilly, you get a very different impression. What about the person's state of mind? What is the effect of otherness, of alienation, of the diaspora existence? Is Jewish music sad, even the music of a converted Jew like Mahler? But there's a lot of joyous Jewish music, and certainly Jews do not have a monopoly on alienation and sadness. Are there other personality traits? What about the people who say all Jews are? Fill in the blank. And then what are the signifiers when we look at music? Well, does the music have lyrics? And if so, what about the content of the lyrics? Now, just because the content may be taken from what the Christians call the Old Testament, does that make it Jewish? Stravinsky's Symphony of Psalms, is that Jewish? Most of Handel's Messiah is taken from the Old Testament. Does that make it Jewish? Maybe songs that deal with the Jewish calendar, the holidays, songs about Jews, or that use Jewish prayer, the parts that may be not found in Christian prayer. Other books that are used by Jews more than by non-Jews, and therefore associated with Jews. Maybe those kind of lyrics would be a signifier. Or the language of the lyrics. If the language is one that is used by Jews more than other people, a language like Hebrew or Yiddish or Ladino. Are there instruments in the music that might be used by Jews more than others? The only instrument I can think of that would really qualify for that would be the shofar. Does the piece have a Jewish title? Mussorgsky, non-Jewish Russian composer, wrote a Hebrew song, and he also wrote a musical picture of two Jews. He called it Samuel Goldenberg and Shmuele. Let's listen to just a few bars of this. So quite apart from the musical content of that, the fact that he called it Two Jews, subtitle, Samuel Goldenberg and Shmuele, could make it Jewish music, despite the fact that Mussorgsky is not Jewish. Brings up the question, can a non-Jew compose Jewish music? Another question, is there some culture that could be said to apply to all Jews? For many Jews, Kol Nidre is the ultimate Jewish music. The lyrics, the association with its context, and for many Jews, it's something like this. But many Jews would draw a blank when they heard that. This is their traditional music. So that's a Yemenite Jewish Kol Nidre. Here's another qualifier, the one that I like the best. Is this musical artifact used by Jews more than by non-Jews? And therefore, do more people associate that musical artifact with Jews? Look, all music has associations. First of all, there are universal associations. consonance and dissonance, the effects of tempo and dynamics. All over the world, if music is faster and louder, it has an effect on the body. If it's slower and softer, it has another effect. There are also personal associations. You know, I still remember a song that was associated with a girlfriend I had in my sophomore year in college. Every time I hear that song, I still think of that person. But that's me. Probably not even her. It's just me. Then there are cultural associations, political, religious associations, associations shared by a group of people, a school song, a national anthem, or the music of your church, your synagogue, your mosque. What about the role of imprinting, early childhood memories, early childhood filtering? Neuroscientists tell us that by the age of 2, we begin to show preference for sounds that have been reinforced by our environment, and we reject sounds that have not been reinforced by our environment. So certain tones, certain scales will resonate with us, even at the age of 2, and others we no longer can relate to. The fact is, all music absorbs other music. It's the process of acculturation. If you compose a song or a symphony, you are not a tabula rasa. You are a product of what you have been exposed to, your musical environment, your soundscape, your taste. And if you perform a song or a symphony, or if you chant the prayers of the Torah, you're not a tabula rasa. You're a product of what you have been exposed to. You are not going to chant it exactly the way your father did or your teacher did. What if a composer sets out to write the great Jewish symphony? What would make it sound Jewish? What if you were commissioned to compose the soundtrack to a film about Jews, say Schindler's List? What would you do? Probably look for those Jewish markers, musical elements that are used by Jews more than others, maybe traditional synagogue melodies, and try to incorporate them into your composition, like this one. Music from Leonard Bernstein's Jeremiah Symphony of 1942. Now, did you recognize the motifs of Haftarah cantillation in that? You know, again, that's an association. Ernest Bloch, as you know, is considered to be one of the greatest composers of concert music based on Jewish themes. In 1916, Bloch told an interviewer, "Racial consciousness is something that every great artist must have. A composer who says something is not only himself, he is his forefathers, he is his people." In other words, Bloch assumed that his best music sounded Jewish because of something genetic, the voice of his ancestors somehow being channeled through his pen. Indeed, 5 years earlier, he wrote, "I noticed here and there themes that are, without my willing it, for the greater part Jewish. It is really strange, this impulse that has chosen me, who all my life have been a stranger to all that is Jewish." What is Bloch saying? It was not his upbringing that resulted in his creating what we might call Jewish music. It was something bubbling up from his racial roots. Is that possible? In his senior thesis at Harvard College in 1939, Leonard Bernstein wrote, "It is easily understandable that a composer whose parents were immigrants still maintains a close contact with the old racial traditions. If the traditions are part of his childhood, they are inevitably part of his life." Now, we might call traditions that are part of your childhood the product of nurturing, imprinting, maybe culture, but the young Bernstein labeled them racial traditions. Perhaps the bottom line is that Jewishness in music lies in the ears of the beholder. Jewish music is defined not by anything intrinsic to its nature, but how it is perceived, how it is received. So I will conclude with a statement by the composer Ernest Bloch, nebulous, but it resonates. He wrote, "I can't tell you what Jewish music is, but it is something that both you and I can recognize and feel, even if we cannot analyze it." And with that, I turn things over to Rabbi Lehman.
Thank you, Josh. I want to take a slightly different tact and also try to make a simple claim about a conception of Jewish music. I'm less interested in the religious commitments or affiliations or even racial, ethnic identities of the composer. I'm really interested in what the music is attempting to do. So from my perspective, if music is attempting to interpret, reflect, respond to, or critique Jewish text, Jewish history, or Jewish experience, no matter the composer's particular relationship to the Jewish tradition, I think that that creates Jewish music. And in fact, I would argue rather strongly with Ernest Bloch on this, that that music doesn't have to feel Jewish, and you don't have to have an innate sense of its Jewishness, because in fact, I think there are forms of Jewish music that we wouldn't recognize as such unless we understood its purpose in terms of responding to, reflecting, interpreting, or even generating Jewish text, history, or experience. And I would also claim that the interpretive, responsive element of music can also give way to a generative form of Jewish music in which music is actually attempting to create Jewish experience, either through developing a musical setting or attempting to generate a response on the part of the listeners toward the Jewish focus and content of the musical themes, maybe the texts to which the music is set, or the interpretation of Jewish history and experience that is at the center of the musical composition. Within that very broad and simple framework, I think it's easy to divide Jewish music into Jewish art music. We might call it Jewish classical music, which is compositions which follow certain forms of classical music expression, Western music expression, highly complex and developed in the particular Western style. There's clearly Jewish folk music, popular music, folk traditions, either related to synagogue liturgy or to various communal musical experience. And I would suggest in more recent years, including this century and the last century, I think there is Jewish jazz. And I don't think that that fits into either of those categories. And of course, there's music that falls in between these categories. For instance, I think highly developed chazanut is neither classical art music in its most constructed form, it's highly improvisational, nor is it folk music in its most popular and common form, and so it might sit somewhere in between. My sense is that music, in order to be considered Jewish music, has to respond to Jewish stimuli. It has to somehow be engaging something that at its core revolves around Jewish experience, either past, present, or future, and will use all kinds of modalities, be they language, be they texts, be they historical settings, relationships between Judaism and other forms of religious and ethnic expression. And for me, looking at Jewish music is an attempt to understand the relationship between the musical form, which has its own integrity, and this Jewish content, and figuring out how the composer or the particular Jewish musical form is somehow engaging both the integrity of the musical language and that Jewish experience, Jewish language, Jewish history, Jewish text. And it's in that engagement between the musical and the Jewish in which something more integrative more synthetic takes place, which becomes Jewish music, and not just secular music, and not just Jewish text or Jewish history. For the purposes of our discussion, I think we have decided to focus mostly on Jewish art music, the classical form, and classical is probably a misnomer, but this highly westernized and composed music. And I think that there's a good reason for that, because the question of what becomes Jewish in that music, since it takes so much of its form and content from the Western musical tradition, which at its core is very much an expression and product of Christendom and Christian Europe, the question of how that form in relationship to Jewish content becomes something uniquely Jewish is, I think, very, very interesting. And it raises the question, of course, in a piece like the Jeremiah Symphony of Bernstein, what makes the music Jewish? Because certainly the folk music, the liturgical music of the Jewish community is more easily identifiable as Jewish, whereas music that comes in this more art form, this more classical form, raises the question of whether, in fact, the Jewish content of the piece really is core to the music itself. Because many have argued that, of course, music is its own language and is really self-referential. It's really not about something outside of its own musical expression and musical language. And I think that whole question of Jewish music, when you are looking at classical forms and you take my thesis, which is that somehow there's an engagement between the musical language and Jewish content, raises the question of, well, is that really relevant in any way to classical forms of music? Or do classical forms of music exist kind of as a sui generis creation, only expressing its own musical logic? So I think for our purposes over the course of these discussions and at the final concert that we're looking forward to, the question of how that classical form relates to Jewish content and to Jewish expression, I think is going to be a pivotal question, and I'm looking forward to hearing other people's understanding of that and the top 10 composers that will come out of this very compelling process.
Thank you, Rabbi Lehman. Judith Pinellas.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about identity markers of Jewish music and speak as a librarian. And so I'm going to start with references to some short reference works on definitions of Jewish music as given in to the general public. So we'll start with Wikipedia, the most used encyclopedia today. Jewish music is the music and melodies of the Jewish people which have evolved over time throughout the long course of Jewish history. In some instances, Jewish music is of a religious nature. Spiritual songs and refrains are common in Jewish services throughout the world, while at other times it is of a secular nature. The rhythm and sound of Jewish music varies greatly depending on the origins of the Jewish composer and the time period in which the piece was composed. This definition starts very much in the middle between the two speakers you have heard already. It speaks of the essence of some of the elements of music, and it speaks again of the function of the music. Another person who is a great collector and producer and publisher of Jewish music, Bevel Pasternak, pointed out that the importance of music in the life of the Jewish people is found almost at the beginning of Genesis. Musicians are mentioned among the three fundamental professions, and music was viewed as a necessity in everyday life. This comment talks more about the definition of music of the Jews rather than Jewish music. Other scholars in a book Music in Jewish History and Culture by Rubin and Barron, defined Jewish music essentially as that music which serves Jewish purposes defined over time or meets the needs of the Jewish people rather than as a particular sound or style of music. They posit that, quote, perhaps the most meaningful answer is that there is no such thing as Jewish music. No particular chord, scale, harmonic type, sequence, or sound that is, quote, Jewish. And the last one that I will look at, Edwin Sarusi, who is the head of the Jewish Music Research Center in Jerusalem, defines Jewish musics rather than Jewish music as music having any single unifying thread or entity of sounds to the wide historical, geographical, religious, secular, folk, composed musics that make up Jewish musics. Jewish music as a construct, it seems to have come out of the needs of a 19th century European nationalism, when the need to define self and other according to a national identity was such a dominant part of Western thinking. Indeed, Jews did not have a country at that time and were known variously as a race or as a nation, as you've heard today. Zionism was an attempt to give Jews their own national music. It seems to me we Jews tend to worry a little bit more about what Jewish music is, at least possibly more than other cultures worry about what really is their music. How many people angst over what exactly is Irish folk music or Italian opera? While there may be outliers, a clear core is understood to belong to those ethnic types of music. Possibly, this comes out of a long history of having the creativities of Jews maligned in the eyes of the European intellectual elite. Possibly out of a lack of self-confidence of Jews themselves in recognizing that what they created was at least as good as the artistic creations of other folk or ethnic groups. And lastly, Jews are accused, according to Ruth HaKohen in her new book, The Music Libel Against the Jews, that according to the Christian worldview, Jews do not produce music, but noise, and that this concept started at least as far back as the Middle Ages in Europe. To Western ears, the synagogue cacophony of murmurs, non-harmonic calling out, wails, cracks, discordant non-uniformity, non-synchronized sounds were not to be fathomed and were just cackling noise. But in fact, to many Jews, this cacophony possibly is one of the most fundamental, elemental Jewish soundscapes of traditional Jewish experience, and is certainly not defined as noise, but the essence of davening, a spiritual moment and depth of Jewish sound and music coming together over centuries. So one might say, the greatest composer is the congregation. In some of the most spiritually compelling moments I've witnessed, in an entry into a traditional synagogue, one might see Jews covered in tallesim swaying back and forth and in a sing-song manner chanting, or what some might call mumbling, their prayers together, but not in uniformity. Jews pray in a group of individuals rather than individuals making up a harmonious group. Indeed, even some modern synagogues, such as one local renewal synagogue, attempts to recreate such moments in slowing down in a meaningful prayer moments the extension of words sung into a cacophony, into dissonance, each person picking their own tone, the whole creating a roomful of extended sound cacophony. This jumble of sounds creates a mystical, spiritual effect for the congregants. Over time, however, some congregants have begun to choose to sing in harmony, blending in and finding the notes of others. Eventually, the cacophony and the effect were lost to harmonious, Western, more familiar sounds. The call and response, recitation of psalms and other prayers, often leading, singing quite dissonant ways, eventually came to harmony. In conclusion, Jewish music is all of the above, including Jewish noise. If used to Jewish purpose and meeting the needs of the Jewish community, we do have a defined and growing body of materials that you will hear in this series that are the focus of study as the most representative types or examples. But to my knowledge, there is no comprehensive collection or anthology encompassing even a large percentage of the entire repertoire. Nor can there be. Jewish music is continuing to evolve, morph, grow, and mature with each new generation as they mash up, heeb-hop, froom-pop it, Yiddish-ish op it, Yiddishize, klezmerize, Israelize, and syncretize musics of all countries, races, styles, and genres into the fold of the Jewish community as the needs and desires of today's Jews demand.
Thank you, Judy. I was worried as we were coming into this, are we all going to be saying the same thing? But we sure are not. On to cantor Dr. Brian Mayer.
Thank you, Josh. And Danny and Judy, as the only cantor on the panel, I'm going to take a cantorial angle to this question of what is Jewish music. And I want to start by quoting one of my teachers and advisors, the eminent composer Hugo Weisgall, who would say to us, his students, Jewish music is for Jews, by Jews, for Jewish purposes. And there was always a twinkle in his eye when he would say that, because Weisgall was essentially challenging us to figure out, did he really mean it? And did he really believe that statement? Well, 25 years later, I'm still mulling it over. I think that he meant it halfway. Weisgall, who was the son of Chazan Abba Weisgall, a Czech-born, very prominent cantor who spent most of his career in Baltimore. Weisgall grew up hearing the traditional Ashkenazi motifs of his father's synagogue song. As a cantor and as a teacher of Chazanut, for me, Jewish music starts with that synagogue song, with synagogue chant. So, of course, we're talking about biblical chant, trop, and in the Ashkenazi settings, liturgical chant, Ashkenazi nusach. But I always have Weisgall somewhere in my viewfinder, so that when I am sitting in a synagogue at a concert and I am experiencing Bernstein's Chichester Psalms, and I'm listening to the second movement with the boy alto, and I'm experiencing this piece with a Hebrew text, which was not commissioned by Jews, but is being done, at least in that synagogue concert, for Jewish purposes, certainly by a Jewish composer who grew up in very traditional sounding services in his youth in the synagogue. I don't hear any Jewish Ashkenazi cantorial synagogue chant motifs in that boy alto solo. And yet I still experience it as Jewish music. Similarly, when I'm sitting in Jordan Hall recently, listening to a concert of Kurt Weil's The Eternal Road. And the section of the prophets is being performed with the soloist as Jeremiah the prophet, who is singing about the doomed city of Jerusalem. And from the orchestra emerges the following melody. I'm in a secular setting, Jordan Hall, New England Conservatory, downtown Boston, at a concert being done by a secular ensemble, the cantata singers. I'm listening to the music of a Jewish subject, The Eternal Road, which is this mammoth piece about the Jewish people's history, written by Kurt Weill, the son of a cantor who also grew up with these traditional motifs that Bernstein did. And when I hear that melody, my Yiddish neshama wakes up. My Jewish soul is aroused because I hear a synagogue chant that takes me to the very subject that is being portrayed by Jeremiah, the destruction of Jerusalem. For that melody has been canonized in Jewish Ashkenaz as a sacred tune associated with the destruction of the temple for the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. Now, as an educated cantor, I don't for a moment think that the Elite Zion melody that I was just chanting, that emerges from that orchestra, was written by Jews, for Jews, or even for Jewish purposes. We can guesstimate that that melody, 1500s, 1600s, was on the German landscape, probably as a folk melody, was absorbed by Jewish communities and sanctified. But I also have seen that same melody in a Lutheran hymnal to a different text than Elite Zion. And we can imagine that the followers of Martin Luther did the same thing that the Jews did at some point, which is to take that melody and to sanctify it for Lutheran purposes. My last example as a cantor is sitting in New York City at the New York State Theater listening to a recent production of Esther, Hugo Weisgall's Tour de Force, his opera on this biblical theme, of course, the story of Purim. And I experienced Weisgall's music, which is a 12-tone piece, as Jewish music. And yet, I don't for a moment in that opera house remember hearing any of those motifs from Weisgall's synagogue childhood. But my Yiddish neshama was stirred to its core. So thinking back 25 years to sitting in Weisgall's classroom and thinking about the twinkle in his eye, this is Jewish music for Jews, by Jews, and for Jewish purposes. Well, you'll forgive me, but it ain't necessarily so.
It was a Jew who said that, wasn't it?
It was.
Thank you, Brian. there's probably a lot of things that we want to say to each other, but we're going to call on some students first who have some questions. As you come up to the microphone, please just briefly identify yourself. And Henry, would you go first, please?
Thank you. My name is Henry Shapiro. I'm in the Cantor Educator program here at Hebrew College. My question is, since we're talking about the top 10 Jewish composers, I decided to sort of ask the question a little bit sort of from the other side. Which composer or performer or person of note would most change the Jewish musical landscape of today by his or her historical absence? Meaning, who has been most influential directly or indirectly in Jewish music? That's my question to the esteemed panel here.
Judy, you want to?
And you can interpret that broadly or narrowly as you so choose.
Well, I had a toss-up for today's music between someone like Debbie Friedman or Shlomo Carlebach. Both of those people opened up an entire genre of Jewish music for any of a number of the Jewish movements, not just their own movements or in one particular group, and changed the landscape of Jewish music in America. So if they had not occurred, either one of those, I think that the track that we would be on would be different for Jewish music today. So in that regard, I consider them, their having been there essential to what is happening in America today in Jewish music. And I'm happy to elaborate more, but.
No, I would agree with that because your question is aimed at the general Jewish public, which is a little bit different from our topic of the top 10, which is perhaps a little bit more elite or rarefied. And those were the two people that I would have mentioned. I might add one more, Hankus Netsky and a few of his colleagues who were responsible for the revival of klezmer music in the early 1970s. And that has had a tremendous influence on what we might call Jewish music worldwide.
I think I would add, because I agree with both Judy and Josh, but I would add Louis Lewandowski in terms of the experience even of early 21st century Jews of classical synagogue music and the extent to which his musical compositions for liturgical music have had such a wide acceptance and usage throughout certainly Western Jewish communities. And I think in many ways the experience of high church Jewish music, if you can say such a thing, was very much influenced by his compositions and his work in Berlin. Many of us actually were present and participated in a festival of his music in Berlin just a few months ago. And I think in many ways the experience of Jewish music and its relationship and engagement with Western music was very much influenced by his work.
Again, speaking as a cantor, I would go back one step further than Lewandowski, and a few generations earlier than Shlomo Carlebach and Debbie Friedman. And that is to go to a different city, and that is Vienna, and to talk about the father of the modern cantorate, and that is Solomon Zulzer. Without Zulzer, there would have been a very much delayed emergence of the modern cantorate. Zulzer was a firebrand. He was a political activist. He was on the barricades of the 1848 revolution. He was a trendsetter. He had students who would make obligatory pilgrimages to study with him in essentially what was a cantorial school in his Seitenstädter Gasse temple in Vienna, which to this day still conducts services as it did when it opened in 1826 with male-only professional choir. Sulzer's melodies are as much a part of our American Torah service as Lewandowski's are to Friday night. And he was the one who really developed this new 19th century, at that time, modern cantor.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thanks. Moving right along, we're running a little bit behind schedule. Becky, please.
Hi, I'm Becky Wexler, and I was wondering if the panel could elaborate on two issues raised directly by President Lehman and Cantor Mayer. The first one is, in picking the top 10, where did non-classical or non- or quasi-liturgical composers like John Zorn, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, etc. fit into the pool? And the second one is, can a composer who is not Jewish compose a piece that is Jewish? And can a musical ensemble entirely comprised of people who are not Jewish play authentic Jewish music?
I'm going to jump in, if I can, on that. For the first part of the question, I think we decided that composers like George Gershwin, who never got around to writing anything that we would call, by our definitions, specifically Jewish. He was going to write an opera based on the Dybbuk, but he died young. Irving Berlin, some of his early songs deal with Jewish subjects, but then you get God Bless America, I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, and Easter Parade, more typical of his output than anything else. So those are Jewish composers who certainly made an impact in the general music field. And someone like John Zorn, on the other hand, and Greg Wall are working in an area of jazz, if I can just use that word in a general way, and I think are making a tremendous contribution, and we will include them in our final topic. In terms of whether a composer who's not Jewish can compose a piece that is Jewish, I would say yes. I think the piece by Mussorgsky that we played would qualify as Jewish music. The soundtrack for Schindler's List was written by John Williams, a non-Jew, and it sure sounds Jewish. I think most people listening to it would call it Jewish music. I'd just relate something that happened to me. The first time I conducted a very non-Jewish piece of music, Handel's Messiah, one of the students in my chorus turned to me and says, "How can a Jew like you conduct a piece like Handel's Messiah? You know, can a non-Jew do a great performance of a Christian work? Would a devout Christian give a better performance of that than I? Would a Lutheran do a better performance of a Bach B minor Mass than I could?" I'm just going to throw those questions out. I don't have good answers to them. Could a non-Jew conduct a piece by the Bloch Sacred Service or a Rossi motet better than I could? I don't know.
I want to actually go further and add to what Josh is saying. There are interesting examples of Jews who have composed what we would consider Jewish compositions, Jewish music, who have written Christian music. So I think of Osvaldo Golijov writing A Passion According to St. Mark. And Golijov himself, who has written some very, very interesting musical settings to all kinds of Jewish historical and experiential texts and ideas. But I think even as a Jew, he can write music that is fundamentally a response to, an interpretation of Christian religious experience.
But he throws a Kaddish.
He does.
Into that setting
which
of
in
the
fact may
Gospels.
be more true to the history of Christianity than Christians would themselves recognize.
Right.
And again, I think the question of Jewish music, for me anyway, is more a function of how is the music attempting to either respond to, interpret, or generate Jewish experience than it is about the particular religious affiliation or ethnic affiliation of the composer or the performer. And I think in many ways, some of the most interesting Jewish music that we will be looking at in these top 10 composers were actually not written for Jewish purposes. They weren't written for Jewish assemblies or Jewish functions or Jewish moments. And in fact, in many ways, from my perspective, the opportunity to share Jewish experience and Jewish interpretation with a very wide audience beyond the Jewish community may be one of the significant functions of Jewish music.
This is far too interesting than the amount of time that we have available to us. I'm going to move along, and hopefully our other panelists can respond to the next questions. Lisa, you're the next contestant on The Question is Right.
I would like to make one comment. My name is Lisa Kippen-Hershenson, and I'm also a cantorial student here at Hebrew College. Because of the fortune of being in Josh Jacobson's music class, I was able to interview Osvaldo Golihov and ask him about his choice of musicians for one of his pieces, Yiddish book. And he chose the Kronos Quartet, whom he loved, from Canada, none of whom of the players are Jewish. And I asked him, how did you get a chance to, did you have to impart the music to them, the sense of the music? And he said, oh yes, in the beginning, I needed to sing each line to them, so they got a sense of the mood and the feeling and the tone and the phrase. So I thought that was interesting. My question is something that you've already all touched on, thank you, about the influence of the music of the diaspora on Jewish music. And given the scope of that phenomenon, I'm wondering if we can really claim this music as Jewish and as our own.
I'll look to that side of the table.
I'm going to give a brief answer to this one, which of course can't do your question any justice. I think of the Ma'us Tzur melody that we all know and love. Da da dee da 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 dum. Again, I've seen that in a Lutheran hymnal. It's a slight alteration. Again, from the German landscape, folk tune, most likely. You couldn't convince anyone in my synagogue that that's not Jewish music.
Thank you.
I guess the question is, how long do you have to use it before it gets to be yours?
Right.
I was going to, I was looking at your question about it being diaspora, and that was a very interesting framing of the question, because, of course, now there's this split between what we think of as the ancient music that came before the dispersion, but now there's also diaspora and Israeli music, and the split that's happening culturally between Jews outside of Israel and Jews in Israel. I wondered whether your question was more from a Zionist perspective, that the real Judaism is happening in Israel, the real Jewish culture, or was your question more coming from the ancient world and looking at the diaspora and its acculturation of other cultures? I wasn't sure. But one of the things that the short answer is yes, we can claim the music as our own. And I would say to that is that all cultures absorb music and culture from other peoples. There is really, certainly in Europe, no such thing as a pure culture, and that's one of the reasons why German culture in the 19th century had to really be invented as German because there had been no Germany per se. Those kinds of things when national states were being formed had to be created the same way when Israel was created, an Israeli culture became part of the event and part of the founding of the state. Nevertheless, the Jewish community has been in diaspora even in biblical times. I mean, in Egypt and Babylonia and other places, there were Jews outside of Israel even while there was biblical Judaism. So we do have a connection. We do have interaction and connections. Unfortunately, today, very deep connections of diaspora community with Israel and vice versa. And in fact, it's very hard for Israelis to see that their music is not Western music, even though 50% of the people are from the Middle East or Jews who derive their ancestry as Mizrahi. That culture has been it's taken 50 or 60 years for that half of the Jewish culture to take hold, even in Israel. Western culture was so predominant.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Lisa. We just have quickly time for one more question. Kevin, please.
Hi, my name's Kevin Margolius. I'm a cantorial student here, and I'm reading a question on behalf of a fellow cantorial student, Risa Wallach. Can Jewish liturgical music ever be irreverent?
Brian, I'm sure that's for you.
I have to take the first swing at this one, huh? No.
Yes.
I think Jewish liturgy can be irreverent. And if Jewish liturgy can be irreverent, meaning that it is both a critique and perhaps even an attempt to question through humor, I think Jewish music can as well.
Right, if irreverent means subversive, then absolutely. I think, because music does have those kinds of meanings, and it can do so, and in a very positive negative way. Well, thank you all. We hope you'll join us for our second program to be recorded at the end of February, Modernism in the Synagogue Before the 20th Century, featuring composers Salomone Rossi, Louis Lewandowski, Solomon Zulzer, and Samuel Naumburg, and panelists Ralph Selig, Brian Mayer, Tina Freuhoff, Mark Kligman, and myself. Thank you.